While they're exiting, let's head over to Matthew 20. I want to finish Matthew 20. We're doing two parables kind of in a reverse order, and that's just because I went brain dead when I was doing it, that I started the one and should have done the other one first. But while we get set, while you're headed to Matthew 20, and somebody's going to hand out notes if you didn't get them, let's just do real quick. Where were fortune cookies first invented? One of these countries. China? U.S.? Hershey? So far you haven't hit the right one. Japan. It's not Mexico. It is Japan. Japan is where they were first invented. Which country first created ice cream? Ice cream, you scream, we all scream. Italy is wrong, U.S. is wrong. China is right. It was first in China. What ancient people invented the toothbrush? Somebody said it. Yeah, right there. The Egyptians did. Okay, what is the fear of fun called? Phobophobia, cheerophobia, hilarophobia, funophobia, hippopotamonstrosescriptdaliophobia, or ergophobia. Which one do you think it is? Fear of fun. None of you are going to try to say E. Okay, it is the cheerophobia. Okay, what is East? What's that a fear of? It's a real fear. If not a fear of hippopotamuses, that's what I would have guessed right away. It's the fear of long words. Isn't that ridiculous? Yeah, isn't that ridiculous? Now, anybody know what ergophobia is? I got it. Not a fear of hair. Okay, that is, no. Okay, it is the fear of work. So some of us have it. Alfred Hitchcock had a fear. Okay, a personal fear. Anybody know what it was? No. It was eggs. Yeah. What animal sleeps the most? Koala, sloth, cat, bat, cows, men on Saturday afternoon. It's the koala. Yeah, absolutely. How would you fill in this blank? Forgiving others is impossible or possible? It's possible? Okay. Other words, forgiving others is what? It's difficult. Commanded. All these are right. Keep on going. Christ-like? Okay, good. It's what? Freeing? Oh, that's a good one. Okay. I just put down several different ideas, okay, that is the idea of forgiving others. In fact, Jesus talked about it in Matthew 18. He gives a tremendous parable. We're going to get to it. But first of all, let's finish out Matthew 20. In Matthew 20, this is the parable we talked about last week. If you weren't with us, we were talking about the parable where Jesus is going to be speaking in the text. And again, context is everything to these stories and why he is giving it. If you remember the context of this one parable that he's telling, a young man came to him, a rich young ruler, and said, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds to him after he tells them, the young man, you need to keep the commandments. He said, I've kept them all. And Jesus is trying to point out, no, you haven't. By asking him then and telling him, okay, if you think you kept everything, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Okay, and so he's challenging this young man. He's basically drawing out of the young man, he's got an idol of goods in his heart. He's got a lack of compassion to help other people, even though he is self-righteous. And so the young man walks away sad. And as the young man is walking away sad, Peter pipes out, and Peter says, hey, we've done just what you said. We've given up everything. We are just sacrificing so much. Is there going to be a reward for us in the future? And Jesus responds, and he says, yes, you're going to be rewarded. You see the reward in chapter 19, verse 28, where he says that you're going to sit on the thrones, talking about the apostles. And then Jesus adds to that there's going to be others rewarded, not just Peter, James, and John. And remember, Peter, James, and John, some of the disciples up to this point they've even told another man, don't go out and preach. You're not with us. You can't be preaching. And Jesus is expanding and saying to them, hey, listen, I'm going to reward others, verse 29, both in this life as well as in the next. And then he makes this comment, and he makes it twice in this text. He says, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. He says it again at the very end of the parable that follows right there, right after that. And so tied together is the first shall be last, and last shall be first, is something to do with this parable and people being rewarded. And in that whole explanation. And so what happens is he goes on and he basically is going to say, those who are involved in the kingdom that I'm established, they're all going to be given similar blessings. You're thinking about you want to be on thrones, and you will have a spot, but everybody who participates in this kingdom is going to have blessings. And so he goes on and he tells that story about a landowner that needed to get his harvest in. And so he went to the marketplace early in the morning, hired some people who agreed to work for one day's wage. The denarii or the pence that you read, depending on your translation, it is a good day's wage for people who are unskilled laborers. It was, usually they got less than that. So the generosity to the landowner is very clear in the parable. So start there, that he's being generous with even those people who are going to agree to work for the whole day. And then he says, I need more workers, 9 o'clock, noon, 3 o'clock. He goes out and gets other workers. And then comes at the end of the day, it's going to be payday, because they would give the daily wages so they could buy their daily bread. And as he's paying them, he says, let's do it in reverse order. And the people who just showed up at late in the afternoon, they get one denarii. They get a whole day's wage, the denarii. And then he pays all of them the same, and even though they work different hours. And by the time it gets to the last group that he's paying, they were the ones who started early in the morning. They're expecting that they're going to get a whole lot more, but he pays them exactly that same day's wage. All of them got paid the same. They started grumbling, the erguzma. They started being really, really upset. And they say, you're not treating us fairly. You've elevated everybody to our same level. And the master responds in this parable, defending himself. It's unstated, but this is a fact. Okay, we said there was 3 basic arguments. Number 1 was everybody getting that denarii was even the ones who worked all day. It was a generous pay. The master is not being selfish. The master is being generous to all of them. Okay, that's number 1. Then the master says, besides that, remember his other 2 comments? You agreed to work for this. This is what you contracted early in the morning. You insisted that here, this would work for us. So I'm giving you exactly what you agreed to. The difference between them and all the other groups, do you remember what it was? Besides, they didn't all work the same time. Do you remember what all the other groups agreed to? Whatever was fair. They left it totally up to the master. They're trusting the master to be fair with them. But this group, they had an arrangement. So he says, I'm being fair with you. And then he also gave a third reason why. Do you remember what the third reason was? It's my money. I can... Okay, and so he makes that comment. And then he tells that whole thing. Look at verse 15. It's lawful for me. And why is your eye evil? The evil eye there is jealous. Why is your eye evil? Because I'm good. And Jesus concludes with the same comment. The last shall be first, the first last. And so he's bringing this all together. And we talked about this last week. What was he talking about? I think this, okay? This is what, and again, you probably have a better idea, but this is what I think. He's getting at the idea that any and all kingdom admissions, those allowed into the kingdom, those who are blessed as they serve the master, those who are going to be rewarded, any activity, any opportunity, anything that's involved with the kingdom, it is by grace of God, not by our goodness. God doesn't owe us anything. But we think in our society, we work on what's fair. And so that becomes the issue. I think what he's talking about with this is he's saying God is all about grace. God doesn't have to be, by the way, fair is what you deserve. If we're talking about what's fair, it's, okay, what you deserve. So if the master gives us what we deserve, okay, we're in hell. So anything he gets us that's good is clearly given by grace. Okay, and so that whole idea, we talked and we were wrapping up last week, anybody allowed into the kingdom, no matter what their background, it's all by grace. In fact, we talked about this. No one can get saved and serve God even of their own accord. And God is gracious. Even if he lets somebody repent as a child early in life, that's grace. Because he saves them from a life of sin. Don't you wish that had been the case for some of us? And is it grace that God would say, so-and-so on their deathbed, they repent and they get saved? It's grace. It's grace. Whenever we get saved, it's because of God's grace. Okay, let's add to that. What about the person who gets saved and they've repented, but they grew up in a Christian home and they lived a pretty good life? It's still they're saved by grace. Okay, what about the person that lived really wicked, immoral, and they repent and they get saved? It's grace. Okay, so then we have this idea, which maybe this is part of it, the disciples, the early and the latter, okay, if somebody gets saved in the book of Acts and they suffer great persecution, their salvation is still by grace. Okay, do we suffer the same persecution that Christians experience around the world? No. And yet we're still saved by grace. Okay, what about the people who in the tribulation have rejected Christ? That's why they don't get raptured. They've rejected Christ. They've not listened. And they get saved because they get another opportunity to get saved. It's still grace. It's still grace. Everything is by grace, okay? Even the fact that we're saved by grace, even though we don't have the same situations as others. And so we have no right to question why God's grace is shared to others in salvation, okay? If God wanted to, God could have, and who knows? We don't think it's true, but if Hitler repented and asked Christ for salvation, it's saved by grace, okay? And so when it comes to salvation, but here's where for us it becomes a problem is, why do some Christians not have the same opportunities and blessings as others? Why do some Christians have more difficulties than others? Why do some have physical issues and others don't have any physical issues? It's all, anything that God blesses you with is still by grace, even helping you through the difficulty. And so it's this whole idea, it's all by grace, and God is sovereign and has the right to do what he wills with his own. That's where we stopped last week. Let's take it a little bit further in just wrapping up our applications. Therefore, we should rejoice in the blessings of God that he puts upon others instead of allowing any hint of jealousy to creep into our hearts. That's a mouthful, but oh boy, this is a challenge. Is it possible that some Christians might get jealous of other Christians' opportunities for service? Some get upset that I don't have the same financial blessings as so-and-so, and I think I'm living more godly than them. Could that creep into a believer's heart? Could it creep into a believer's heart that I don't get to have as big a class as somebody else at the church? Can that creep into a heart? Can it creep into the heart of even, you can guess this one, can it creep into the heart of preachers to become jealous that their church isn't as big as somebody else's church? The bottom line is, it's a battle. And so if we look at it, Jesus is talking to the disciples in this parable, telling them, I'm going to bless you, but he's warning them, don't get jealous with one another. Because the disciples, did they have a difficulty this way? Did they ever struggle which one of them gets the greatest recognition? James and John, they go, their mom goes, whether she's put up to it or not, we don't know. She goes, and when she says, can my two sons sit at your right hand, left hand, and what do the others respond? They're upset. They're really arguing. Do you remember what they're arguing? That happened. It's stated 2 or 3 times in the Gospels. Along the way, the disciples were discussing amongst themselves who should be the greatest. In fact, we have all these different accounts that it comes down to that they're doing it. Even the foot washing, when we talked about last week, you just made comment. The reason that none of them washed anybody's feet is they were arguing over who's the greatest. So I'm not washing your feet. You should be washing my feet. Okay. And so it was a common problem, which brings us to this idea. And I was going to jump over it, and I thought, no. I think it's really worthwhile for us to just do the application of the parable and spend these few minutes here this morning. Reality. Being involved in God's kingdom work now. Now, we're going to be in the kingdom in the future, but right now we're in the kingdom work, preparing and getting people saved and working towards that idea of Jesus Christ should be your Lord and Savior. We're promoting the King. Think this through, okay? Being involved in the kingdom work does not remove our battles and struggles with each other, okay? I know we want to say out loud, we all get along 100%. And that's what we should be striving for. But is it possible in a church there could be hints of jealousy for the way God is answering their prayers, the opportunities they get? Can that happen? Well, it happened in the New Testament several times. We read about the believers not having a humble spirit. They're begrudging one another. They're upset. They're fighting about things in the local church. And so this idea that we need to be careful, we need to constantly guard and arm ourselves with the right attitude towards one another. You know, we're most concerned about this relationship, but we have to make sure this relationship is righteous as well too, and pleasing to the Lord. So we need to resist the natural temptation to be envious of others who have easier challenges, more blessings. So biblical resistance, and I'm going to use alliteration here, just several R's, that are important for us in having the right attitude with each other is remembering. Number one, we need to remember. When we're tempted to become short with somebody, when we're tempted to get jealous of somebody, when we're tempted that, you're not being fair to me and whatever, we need to remember that anything we are allowed or have is by grace. Period. Nobody owes us. Christ doesn't owe us. If I were to be jealous of a preacher whose church is much bigger, I have to remember that what ministry I have is clearly by God's grace. God didn't owe me because I'm so intelligent. God didn't owe me because, I grew up in Minnesota, okay? God didn't owe me anything. And so that idea was just, okay, don't go there, because what you have is by God's grace. Number two, we should be rejoicing in God's blessings upon others, not resenting it, not regretting it, not, saying, it's not fair, We should be rejoicing they have the opportunity to do it. And I'm going to keep with my illustration just for the fact that I'll stay out of trouble of bringing up others. Okay, so some guy has a much bigger church. He's got the radio, TV ministry. Instead of being upset about that, I should rejoice that he's able to preach the gospel. And thank God that he can preach. And they have the abilities and will be able to do it. Instead of resenting the person, be glad that they're being blessed of God. Yes? Okay. So request God to bless them more and more than he does you. I forget, there's just the two preachers, and I've shared the story with you before. They were both in Britain, and they both had really fantastic ministries. But the ones that I started to get a little bit more envious of the other in his ministry, and it just convicted my heart. And so I went to see him one day and talked with him and said, I'm going to be praying for you every day that God would bless your ministry more and more. And he says, you know what? God has convicted my heart the same thing. Instead of us making comparisons and our people saying, you're a better preacher than him and da-da-da-da, let's just covenant to pray for each other that God would bless each other's ministry. And it made a tremendous attitude difference for both of those men. Relinquish your right to be served or noticed. In this text, that's what Jesus is promoting, that idea. In fact, go to where he says it shortly thereafter. Go down to verse 28. Even as the Son of Man came not to be, do you remember this? Served, ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. The Lord's mentality was not serve or notice me, but the Lord's mentality was, I was going to serve others. So instead of being jealous, let's be joyful for them. Let's keep in our mind, it's all by grace. Let's say, God, I don't need to be noticed. I'm here to serve and not to be served. Let me throw one other thought here that closes. Rallying others to notice and commend others. If you have a difficulty, with somebody, maybe the way to respond is, instead of letting that creep in your heart, draw people's attention to say, hey, do you see how talented so-and-so is? This preacher does such a wonderful job. You should listen to him online. And instead of resenting, rally others to benefit from that ministry or from that person's blessings. You apply it to your level and your position. But it's a very serious thought, one that's a challenge for each and every one of us. And I'm going to guess that, with the leading of the Lord, that this is a battle that we're going to be facing in the next week. Somewhere, someplace, some of us are going to all of a sudden be confronted with this idea of being upset with somebody or being envious of somebody because they had a position that was given to them, because something worked out better for them than it did you. Be careful of the jealousy. So that's that parable. Let's jump into the next one by going in reverse order. Chapter 18. Chapter 18. In this parable, this is the parable on forgiveness that most every one of you knows by heart, that you have some concept of it. Maybe not all the details, but you have an understanding. But still, it's worth our while going back to it. So let's get the setting of the parable. And in order to get the setting, again, we're backing up a little bit, and we're spending some time in the previous context so that it'll make more sense. So we start chapter 18 in verse 1. What do we have? What's going on? The disciples just love one another. They get along perfectly. What are they doing? Okay, Mark says that as they were on their way, they were arguing with one another. And then they get to the home. Now, this is when Jesus is up in the, remember, he is now focusing the latter part of his ministry on training the disciples. He does public ministry, but the bulk of it is training. So he's up in Capernaum, which is his headquarters, so to speak, that he was operating out of. And he's in somebody's home. And many think it may be Peter's home, that's where he's at. And it may be even Peter's kid that he pulls to himself. We don't know for sure. But he's there, and along the way, they've been arguing amongst themselves over which was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And the reason they may have done it, if you flip back the next page or the next chapter, what was the big event that just happened that Matthew records? Shortly before then. The Transfiguration. Okay, think the story through. The Mount of Transfiguration. Who went with Jesus up to the mountaintop? Peter, James, and John. Okay, where were the others? You don't have to give a place, just in a general sense. Where were they? Okay, they're at the bottom of the mountain. The others are at the top of the mountain. And when the guys are at the bottom of the mountain, somebody comes to them and says, my son is afflicted by a demonic spirit. And you guys have been casting out demons. What happens? They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And when Jesus comes down from the mount, okay, he rebukes him. What does he do with the demon? He casts it out, and they say, why couldn't we do it? And he says, this can only come by prayer and fasting. Okay, so you understand the story real well. So that's setting. And right after that, they're arguing over who's the greatest. Can you picture why? Peter, James, and John can say, we saw Jesus transfigured. He took us with us. You guys, you couldn't even cast out the demon. You guys are real low on the totem pole compared to us. And so they're having this argument, they're having this discussion, and so, and then right after that, Peter is the one that's told to go out and fish and catch the fish, and inside you're going to find the coin to pay the temple tax. So can you imagine Peter's attitude? I get to see Jesus in his glory. You guys can't even cast out demons, and he picks me to catch that fish miraculously. So guys, I'm it. I'm the greatest. Now, Peter would never shoot off his mouth. So you have that situation, and Jesus is there. And again, that's why some think it might be Peter, because he's the mouth. And Jesus is going to teach him. And so anyway, so he pulls the child to himself, and he starts this whole lesson that he's talking about the little children. Jesus called a little child to himself and set him in the midst. And he said, "Verily, verily, or truly, truly, I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not" what? Okay, you're not going to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so he's pulling the child, and again, understand, how did they view kids back then? Do they view them the same way as Western world? No, they didn't. And let's add something to it. Let's add a, and I'm not trying to diminish the fact that they didn't care. Please don't think that. But think about how it could be tempered. What happened to many of the children that were birthed? They die. Okay, when you start looking at the mortality rate, when you start looking at the natality rate, that it was pretty high back in these cultures. So from a perspective, you love your child, but maybe you don't want to be as attached. You want to keep somewhat of a, because these children are very fragile. Is that the word? Okay. Our Western mentality in our day and age is different than some ancient worlds. Because when our kids are born, what are we pretty much thinking? And medically, what's true? Yeah, they're birthed, they're good. You made it through the pregnancy, they birthed, they arrived okay, and they're going to be here for a while. Back in the ancient world, it wasn't that way. And so I'm not saying they didn't love, but there's a little bit of apprehension. And as well, in their culture, children too were to be seen and not heard. Okay, in our culture, we operate by that today. Okay, we have a whole different culture. And so back then, the child was considered and remember for most of that culture, your biological child may not be your heir. There was a difference there. What was the thing that had to happen for you to really say, this is my child legally, publicly? They adopted the kids. You adopted your own biological children. You legally said, I have elevated them. So he's doing a child that has not been elevated. And so he's bringing this child and bringing him to him. And by the way, rabbis, they would use characters a lot in their teaching. They would drop names. They would bring historical characters. That idea of the Old Testament was very, very common. They tell stories about ancestors, and they were heroic people. And even if you read rabbinic writings that are in the ancient time, they would name drop people that they knew or other people and talk and use them to elevate. Somebody who was a successful businessman, somebody who was a successful rabbi, somebody who was, they made some tremendous contribution to family, society, warfare. What about children? What contribution have they made? Basically, the reality is they haven't. So it's very, very, very rare in any rabbinical writings of that time that they would use illustrations of children, because the children were just not heroic enough. They were not contributing enough. Does that make sense? So Jesus is taking a child that everybody in their mind, they're an insignificant person. But you understand what I mean by that? It's not that they're not of value, but they really haven't made a contribution yet. I know it sounds really harsh the way I'm saying it, but I'm trying to get you to put your feet in their sandals. For Jesus to say, you should be like a child, was almost offensive to them. Okay? It would almost be on the same par as, remember another parable? He used the hero in the story was a bad apple in everybody's eye. Do you remember the guy was beaten up? And who does the rescuing? A Samaritan. And you tell the Jews, you walk up and you're the teacher and you're saying, you Jews should be like Samaritans. That was like, you Americans should learn something from Hamas. And we would say, yeah, what? Are you kidding? So he brings a child, which is not as offensive as Samaritan, but it's pretty close. I'm a parent, I'm a businessman, I'm an older person, and I'm supposed to learn from a child? Are you kidding me? We at times accept this without any problem because we say, out of the mouth of the babes. And we, at times, it's okay. Part of it is our culture, who in TV sitcoms, let's say, who are usually the smartest people in the house? The kids. So we have a mindset in our culture that we can learn from kids. And we don't resent that, but put yourself in a culture that's not the case. That he brings this kid and he's saying, okay, I want you to be like little children. And like, what? What have they offered? What have they done? And he says, unless you be converted, I'm not going to get through this lesson, except they be converted. Okay, and go on, watch what he says. And remember, what have they been arguing about? Who's the greatest? Look at the next verse. He says, and whosoever therefore shall not humble himself as a child, he says, whoever does, humble himself shall be what? He'll be the greatest in the kingdom. So you have to look and say, okay, Jesus is talking about, let's do the first phrase. If you're going to enter into the kingdom, and they're arguing over who's going to be the greatest, let's just stop there and let's just make sure you're going to get there. Okay, let's start with point number one. Because is there a disciple that we know of that isn't headed that direction? Okay, so the first thing he does is let's deal with the first issue. Are you converted? Okay, are you like a little child when it comes to the qualities that are needed? So you have to answer this question to understand the text. What childlike qualities is he looking for anyone to get into the kingdom of God? Unconditional love? That the child has unconditional love? Okay, we got to be like a child. What else? What did you say? Innocence? What did you say? Dependency? Curiosity? What did you say? Obedience? No pride? Okay. So in that sense, okay, if we just say, okay, the childlike qualities that he's talking about is this whole idea that, and I know some kids are braggarts, but for the most part we're talking about the kids don't have anything to bank on. They don't have money to buy their way into heaven, right? Okay. They don't have any achievements that they can look at. So they're basically are totally dependent upon the parent. And so you put this all together, like you said, there's the curiosity factor, there's the willingness, there's the idea of, okay, I want a relationship with the parent. And so they have to come that way to be part of the kingdom. Judas is very oriented towards what he can do and what he can get. And the childlike faith is, I am going to be, typically, I think this is true, typically kids are just plain satisfied, and again, materialism and all that, but the kids really don't care about the car and all that kind of stuff. They just want to make sure mom and dad are around, okay, that they're there. And they want a relationship with mom and dad. And so as a kid, it's like, okay, here's where we're going. that total dependency. And then he adds to it that you have to have childlike humility as well, which in their culture, it would be more, that would be more of a reality because the kids were to be silent. The kids weren't, they weren't lauded. Let me throw this out. What kind of sports community programs did kids have in ancient world? None. Okay, so they weren't doing this thing that our kids today, they do all these different things and they get trophies, they get awards. And I'm not saying it's bad, but they didn't have that in that culture. You weren't cultivating all these skill sets of the kid other than work. And so he's saying, okay, there's a humility here that's required. And Jesus is just, before you go anywhere, Jesus has just reversed once again the idea of how we should live is totally opposite of what the world says. He does it all the time. He says, if you want to get, you have to give, okay? If you want forgiveness, you have to be willing to forgive others. It's totally backwards. And he's doing it right here. If you really want to be noticed, be like a kid. Be not me, just, have that true humility involved. And then he gives this lesson, and the lesson is, it's a fascinating lesson that he goes on, and he says, and who shall receive one of the little children in my name receives me. Whoso offends one of these little ones which believes in me, it were better that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned. Woe to the world because of these offenses, for it must needs. In other words, there's going to be offenses. Just don't you be the one that's bringing them. And so he's talking about these little kids, and the question that we have is that we need to define before we go any further when he talks about the little kids that don't offend them. Otherwise, it's better for you to be, in the sea. The little ones, verse 10, don't despise them, that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of the Father. He says that concept of these kids are important. Who are the little ones in this text? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about, all the way through, is the little ones reference to physical children? Okay, which is a possibility. Okay, what's another possibility we're talking about? What's that? New believers, babes in the Lord. What's another that's the second possibility. There's a third possibility. Okay, basically, I didn't hear from the back. Okay, us, of all ages. In other words, are we still little children before God? Yeah, we need to rely upon him. We have nothing, we're just, okay. And so there's three possibilities that he's talking about, since all of us to a degree are kids growing in the Lord's work. So who is he talking about in this text? I think yes. Okay, it's multiple guess. I think it's yes. Okay, and so he's talking about these folk, and I believe he's talking to even our relationships here, because it's kicked off by disciples arguing over who's the greatest. So he offers several specific statements of how you treat one another. Be very careful, because we're all little kids. As little kids, we're fragile. We got to make sure that we don't hurt one another. We have to make sure we protect one another. We care for one another. Okay, and so he gives us commands in this passage. Did you see the verbs here if we go through with this group? Look at the verbs that he says about how to treat one another. Verse 5, you have a verb. What's the command? With one another. What's that mean, to receive one another? Welcome, accept him. Okay, it has that concept, okay, receiving is enthusiastically opening your arms and saying, good to see you. Okay, it's more than just walking up and going, hey. Okay, it has more meaning to that. Sometimes I might say to you, Mike, hey. Yeah, but because we know each other, it's able to say the hey has more meaning. Does that make sense? So it's showing genuine gratitude for that person and embracing the weak ones. Okay? What's another command in the text? Jump down, and he says, receive them. Oh, what are you supposed to avoid? Verse 6. There we go. Don't do what with them? Don't offend them. Okay, what's it mean to offend them? Don't think American culture the way we talk offending. Think Bible culture when Jesus uses the word to scandalize somebody. What's that? I didn't catch the first part, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Okay, being jealous of them. Okay, thank you. Oh, you even remembered that. Super, okay. Somebody else piped up and said another word. Okay, it's that idea of you causing them to stumble, to sin, the jealousy like the disciples had and causing that man to stop serving. The idea is to literally don't trip them up. Now, in the law, you could be taken to court if you purposely put something in another person's path who couldn't see, who was handicapped. And if you put something in their path that caused them to be harmed, you'd be taken to court, and you could suffer the same punishment. So if you put something in the path of somebody else who's young in the Lord or unaware, and you cause them to stumble, there's a penalty. We read about that more in the New Testament, where 1 Corinthians 8, if you stumble a weaker brother, you so sin against, not just them, you sin against who? You sin against God, Jesus Christ. Okay. He gives them another command in verse 10. Okay, verse 10, he tells them, take heed that you do not what? Don't despise these people. Make sure you don't despise. And that word despise is just very simply, it's the idea to look down upon, to be critical of, to tear somebody down. This is the idea of, okay, if I can bring it to modern 2024, some of you've shared church experiences, that you were in a church before you were saved. Church was just a fashion show. People would come in and they would just look at how other people are dressed. And if they weren't dressed as good as you were, what did you think of them? You thought less of them. Okay, you'd criticize. If they didn't drive as nice of it, that's the idea of despising, putting people down because maybe they're not like you, or you're critical of them. And he's taking that to task. And in this text, he's telling us why we need to be careful this way in how we treat one another. Because as he goes through, we already talked about, if you're receiving them, you're receiving Christ. What does that mean, that if I'm nice to you, I'm receiving Christ? How does that work? What's that? Okay, the fruit of the Spirit, excellent. Somebody else? Okay, excellent. Okay, there's two possibilities of this is, if I'm receiving Bob, I'm receiving Christ. In other words, I'm treating him not like Bob, but I'm treating him like he's part of Christ. That's part of it. There's another aspect of it is, if I'm treating Bob decent, I'm going to maintain a good relationship, not just with Bob, but with Christ. Do you remember how he says it with husbands? That you don't leave arguments with your wife and unsettled things, lest your prayers be hindered. And so this idea is that it affects my relationship with Jesus Christ if I'm not treating other believers in a proper way. So one of the reasons I want to be caring towards one another, towards you, is because it helps me in my walk with the Lord. But he also makes it clear that, hey, listen, if you don't do this, there's going to be some form of discipline. And he uses that idea of a millstone. Anybody remember what a millstone is? What's that? It's heavy. Okay, if you were at home, say your wife is this huge baker at home. Maybe she is. Okay, and she's going to make everything homemade. You would get her a small millstone. Today we call those rolling pins. Okay, but you would have a millstone for her. How big do we think it would that she would be pushing the bread with? Yeah, hers wouldn't be, yeah, okay. What millstone do you think he's talking about here? Yeah, some of you, now exactly what Dan's got there is, then if you were all the farmers in the community and you were going to get your flour ground, you'd have an ox tied to that millstone. And that thing would just go around and around, it would crush everything. That's the millstone in this one. That it would better, and if a millstone's tied to your neck, what's the chances of swimming? Right? Okay, so it's very clear, this is going to be bad. And in fact, then he goes on, he says that idea that if you're not right with God, this shows what your heart is. It shows you don't have an unrepentant heart. It shows that you aren't right with God. It shows that you're not born again, because you're hellbound. And if there's not that compassion, and that fits the New Testament, because he says in the New Testament, whosoever does not love doesn't know God. Remember 1 John? It's built on this theme of knowing God. One of the greatest ways is, how do you treat other believers? And so, in fact, if you don't have this compassion for other people, and you have the jealousies, the angers, the different things, and it's holding you back, it would be better for you to cut off your hand or to... And he's not saying let's be masochistic. He's just saying take drastic measures to get this type of attitude out of your life, because you're in danger of hellfire. And so he's warning him. And there's another reason. Look down at verse 10. We ought to love one another because God loves all of his children, so much so that what does God give all of us? What does he assign to us? Okay, not just grace. Angels to take care of, to help protect and guide us. And in fact, God so loves us, and that's where we're going to get a new parable. But for the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. And he's talking about those within his fold who have walked away. If he has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, what does he do? Does he say, I got 99, I don't care about the one? He goes after the one. God's compassion for believers he's illustrating God's compassion for all of us is, what word do you want to put in there? Does he favor me more than he favors you? No, he loves us all the same. Okay, now do we have different positions? Yes. Different responsibilities? Yes. Yeah, okay, say yes. Yes, we do. We have different. Does he love the ladies more than the men? Okay, let me rephrase that. Okay. Does he love the men more than the ladies? In that culture, they would have said, does he love the adults more than the kids? In that culture, they would say, and in that culture, do they love the rich more than the poor? In that culture, they'd say that. But we know what he's saying here is he loves. Okay, and so what should we do? We should be without prejudice or showing favor towards different groups. And so he's got all that, and then he's challenging them in verse 13, 14, where he says that he goes, he rejoices, and he says in the end of verse 14, even so is the will of God that not one of these little ones should perish. God doesn't want to lose any of us, okay, in carnality or whatever. Then right after that, okay, he's talking about it, and he launches... This is still introduction to the parable, okay? He launches into a whole section about protecting the little ones. Protecting who? When we say the little ones, what are we talking about? Okay, believers, all of us. Look what he does in verse 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. He says, if somebody is hurting you, by the way, if they're hurting you, the chances are they're going to hurt somebody else. So he says, moreover, if your brother shall trespass against you, then what do we do? If we really care for one another, and if there's conflicts brewing, what do? We change churches. We don't talk to them anymore. We go to the other side of the auditorium, so we don't see them anymore. We go to the balcony, or we come out of the balcony, depending where they sit. Is that what he says we do? No, what do? He says, okay, if there's a problem going on, take me through the order real quick. What's the thing we're supposed to do? We're supposed to try to restore that person, and what's my steps? I go to them privately, one-on-one. You go privately and address the offense or the whatever it is. And if they listen to you, you have gained your brother. This is all about not you proving a point. It's not about you winning an argument. It is about you gaining a brother, reconciliation. If we in our Christianity would get over the idea that I have got to prove myself right, we would get rid of a whole lot of difficulties in relationships. It's not about right, it's about being right with one another, not being right in your opinion. And so he goes on, he says, okay, if they don't listen to you, then what are you supposed to do? You're familiar with this text, so let's run through it real quick. I got a couple minutes. Take one or two. And he calls them witnesses. Why? Why do you take witnesses? Okay, that's a good possibility. That if Mike and I had a conflict, I would take a couple of you, we'd go and talk to Mike, and then it's not afterwards Mike can say, well, I did this or I said this. Okay, what other reasons? Well, go ahead, say that again. Could I? Let's say I'm going to go and talk to Mike about a problem. Okay, this may be, I may be twisting it different than what you meant, but this is what's in my mind. If I'm going to go talk to Mike, and I've gone to him and I told Mike that I just think that the way you rip and tear into the parking lot, yeah, well, I saw that, yeah, those black marks out there, okay. And so I'm all ticked off about the way he parked his vehicle. Here's the parking space, and he's got it like this, and he's taking 3 parking spots. And he just squealed in there. And I'm really upset, and I'm going to talk to him because I find that very offensive. Okay. And I'm going to take somebody with me. I've talked to Mike, and Mike has blown me off. And I take somebody with me, and I say, Bob, you want to come and talk? Bob might have, I don't know, Patty, if this was Bob might have a different perspective to calm me down. Does that make sense? Yeah, when you look at me, you say, yeah, that makes sense. But if you look at yourself, sometimes it's helpful that somebody else may have a different perspective and give you and say, wait, maybe. Or if I am really emotional, and I don't get that way, you can tell. I'm very non-emotional. Okay. So if I'm going to go and talk to Mike about the way he parked that pickup and the stupid stuff that he did, and I'm using those words, what might somebody help me with? Okay, rephrasing it, keeping me from, getting angry and start picking on his hair. Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah. The pot calling the kettle black, absolutely. Let me make sure mine is down. Okay. So he might temper me. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have all this, and we can go all through that whole idea, and it may show the seriousness that, hey, Mike, these guys agree. There is in the multitude of people, there is some force there, and if he doesn't listen to us, then what do? Take it to the assembly. Okay, so then we communicate it to the body, and we spread all kinds of rumors about Mike and his driving. What are we supposed to be doing with this? Now, follow your verses. Look at your verses, okay? This is caring, and forgiveness is all a part of this, and I know I'm not getting to where I wanted to be, but the idea here is when we take it to the assembly with the witnesses, we tell it to them, it says, if he neglects not to hear the church. Implied in that is you're going to talk to him as well. And not only should you be talking to him, you should be willing to listen. But let me take you to a verse that's following there, okay? For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, what's he implying there? What are we doing? We're praying. We're praying for Mike or for his pickup to stall. We're praying, okay? We're doing something here. But if they still insist on not listening, then we let them be as a heathen and a publican. The idea is we do a form of separation. This is called church discipline. Unfortunate word. It should be church reconciliation. Recovery instead of discipline. The whole goal is recovery. But the idea is, okay, we limit our fellowship with him so he gets the sense that this is serious. This is really serious. And so it demonstrates separation. It's very hard to do, to show this type of, it's hard to go and talk to Mike about his driving. Okay? Because most of us would say it really bothers us, but who would we talk to? Each other. Instead of going to To him. It's easier to talk to you than it is to talk to him. And so Jesus is saying here, he says, wait a minute, if you're going, understand, because some people say, well, who am I to say? If you two agree on anything, it shall be done in heaven. In other words, you've got God's authority to go and say what you're doing is wrong based on the word of God. And then as well, you speak with that authority, and then you say, hey, listen, God's going to be behind you. So you pray. And then as well, Christ is with you when you're doing this ministry. On the heels of that, Peter pipes up and says, how often do we forgive Mike for his crazy driving? And Peter says, we should forgive him. Peter says. Jesus is going to say that. What does Peter say? 7 times. Okay, that's tonight, Wednesday, next Sunday, the next Wednesday. After that, we're towing you. Okay? And Jesus is going to say, 70. So we got 490 times. And then we're towing you. Is that what Jesus meant? Let's pick up next time. Okay. Thank you.